part of being a missionary in Panama, but also doing the stateside work, as you mentioned earlier, you were able to travel all over the world, which gives you quite a perspective as a long-term missionary, and also just being exposed to other fields and working in the mission office. Maybe give us a little synopsis of your philosophy of missions, if you will.
I think that this has probably always been my philosophy of missions since I first studied missions and then became involved in the early years. But the years I was working in the office as Director of Field Operations and was able to travel around the world and see God's work in a number of different contexts, I think helped crystallize my thinking. Basically, it's like this. The field is the world. There are lost people anywhere you go. There are lost people in your neighborhood, on your street, in your city, in your town. The United States needs the gospel in a desperate way. We all know that. But then there are places in the world where not only are they not saved, but they have absolutely no exposure to the gospel. They are unreached, they're even unengaged. No one has ever tried to take the gospel to a lot of the people groups in the world. And while all people equally need the gospel, because the Bible says that Jesus is the only way to God, there's no other name under heaven by which we can be saved. And while all people do equally need the gospel, because all people without Christ are lost, not all people have equal access to the gospel. Mm-hmm. And so it has shown me and deepened my concern for getting the gospel to those who are truly unreached and perhaps haven't even been targeted to be reached in any way. We must never get away from that. Mm-hmm. That's ultimately where missions is headed. Mm-hmm. Even though we work here, win people in our neighborhood and in our town, we have our local churches, but ultimately the purpose of every church is to get the gospel to the ends of the earth. Mm-hmm. That's what the Great Commission says. And along the way, one of the things that I learned or saw more clearly was that the harvest is at different stages in different places. I would present it this way when I go to churches, because having traveled, I got to see a lot of fields. I got to meet missionaries who were my heroes when I was a kid, Carlisle Hanna, Bobby Poole, and people like that who are much older than me or several years older than me. And I got to spend time with missionaries who were my age, my contemporaries, and those who were a lot younger. And I was in all these different countries. So I would go to fields and I would tell people, now we have fields out there, we have countries that are very responsive or receptive to the gospel. And the truth is, we're seeing harvests come in places like India, Ivory Coast, Cuba, in just far faster rate than people are coming to Christ in America. I mean, those are places where the growth of the church is explosive, and we thank God for that. And that's a wonderful thing to see. And then on the other extreme, we have not only the responsive fields, but we have the restricted access countries where we're just beginning to get involved with. The Muslim world, for example, where 99.9% of the people don't know Christ. And you have to be creative in your approach and getting in as a professional to teach computers or to dig wells so that people can have clean drinking water, or find ways to engage them so that you can show them and tell them about the love of Christ. So there are those kinds of countries, and we're just beginning to scratch the surface there. But then there's a third category, which I think a lot of our people in America don't fully understand, and that would be what I would call the resistant fields. There are places that we as a mission work and have worked for many decades. And I'll mention 4 countries specifically: Spain, France, Japan, and Uruguay. Those are 4 countries that I have a deep burden for. I've been there. I have sat down and broken bread with missionaries and French believers, Uruguayan believers, Japanese Christians, and know their passion and their love for the Lord. And yet those are fields that we look at back here and say, well, you don't see very much happening there. They have such few believers and they have so few churches. You know, what's going on? Shouldn't we be sending everybody where there's more results? And I say no, absolutely not. I think if we're ever going to see a harvest, we've got to be faithful till God breaks through. Sometimes it may take generations to dig out that church and to reach what some people call a tipping point. And once the church has been established and is strong enough to carry on its own ministry, you're going to start seeing harvest.
But we're seeing that in
But we are beginning to see it. That's the encouraging thing.
in these places.
Some of those places I've been mentioning, like Uruguay and Spain, France and Japan, are beginning to see some signs, very encouraging signs, that more people are coming to the Lord. I just read this week of several people in Japan who recently have made profession of faith. And for that many in that short of time, that's kind of unusual. And I do know they're having some things going on in France that are tremendously exciting in terms of the gospel challenging that very secular society. And so I'm encouraged. But that's kind of my philosophy. I believe that we just stay faithful in doing the work God's called us to do. I mean, you read of missionaries like Adoniram Judson and others in the old days who went 7 years before they ever saw a convert. Tom Willie Jr. said that when he came to Panama here. It was several years before he saw the first person come to Christ. And now we're having a lot of people saved. So sometimes you just have to be faithful.
Faithful and persevere.
Persevere.
Well, thank you for sharing with us. And thank you both for your ministry to Free Will Baptist, but most importantly to the Lord.
Thank you.